Welcome to Transcending Comics, a podcast dedicated to trans representation in comic books, manga, and webtoons, both on panel and behind the scenes. I'm your host, Tommy, and joining me today is someone who helped inspire the creation of this podcast. She's a co-host on the My Marvelous Year podcast, as well as their spin-off show, Extra Issues. She's a comics scholar, often described as a comic book rainbow belt, and having heard dozens of episodes of her shows, I can tell you she has impeccable taste in books. She's here today to discuss her recently finished dissertation exploring Al Ewing and Kieran Gillen's depictions of Loki in Marvel Comics, and the evolution of the characters found in Loki, Agent of Asgard, and Young Avengers. With no further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show the writer behind this incredible dissertation, Charlotte Fierro.
Hello, glad to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this incredible introduction. Couldn't have done it better myself. I'm really glad to be here and talk about the work that has haunted me for the full year of 2023.
Yeah, I've got to know, how did you come to this decision to write an over 40-page dissertation on this particular depiction of Loki?
So I'm not too familiar with the American university system, but I was doing a master's degree in children and YA literature, which that's the official name is in French littérature de jeunesse, which is youth literature is the literal translation. But it entails everything that's books and comics and everything literary for children, anywhere between when you're born to when you're 20, 25, up until young adults, basically. But also everything that's in the realm of imaginary fiction, science fiction, fantasy, everything like that we talk about. And that was 2 years of that master's degree. And by then you're supposed to write a master's thesis. And I decided to do it about the character of Loki in Marvel Comics. First of all, because there's not that, especially in France, there's not that much study, actual university studies about comics. Surprisingly enough, it's a huge medium. Culturally, it's one of the biggest things in the world. Maybe superhero movies more than comics, but superheroes are huge, and there aren't that many studies about it. So I wanted to do something related to that, and so because it's my field of knowledge, I'm a comic book podcaster and everything, and the character of Loki is one of, if not my favorite character in superhero comics and Marvel Comics specifically, because of, I think, what the character is about, and specifically because of the books with the characters written by Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing in the 2010s. And so that's a character I'm really interested about. Those comics, from Journey into Mystery to Loki, Agent of Asgard, are some of my favorite ever Marvel comics. And I wanted to take that opportunity to dive into what makes them so special to me, and also what do I not know yet about them, take the opportunity to delve into those better. And I think that's just what I did. So yeah,
I was honestly really thankful for the opportunity to read both Young Avengers and Loki, Agent of Asgard, because both of those books I'd been kind of turned away from for stupid reasons for a long time. Young Avengers, the original run of Young Avengers had been one of my first and favorite comics. So seeing it come back with a different writer I hadn't known yet, and not the same team, I was oh, I don't know about this. And then Loki, Agent of Asgard, I was first exposed to on a Rick Remender binge of Uncanny X-Force and Avengers and the Axis event. So my first issue I tried was Loki, Agent of Asgard, number 8, or the Axis crossover.
Axis tie-in, yeah.
The whole event is around characters having their total personality or good and bad reversed. Agent of Asgard, I feel also flips the style of book it is, and instead of being this really cool modern thing, it's all written in an older style. And I don't usually love that when comics try to write themselves like an older comic, and I just assumed that's what the whole book was. So I got halfway through that first issue, I'm this comic sucks. I get that. This thing is terrible. I'm never coming back to it. And then over the next few years, everyone was talking about oh yeah, Loki, Agent of Asgard, it's one of my favorite books, and I thought they were just Tumblr fans of Loki.
I mean, there's some of that, definitely. That's a big thing for the character of Loki, is the mix between the character from the comics, the character from the movies, and the character from Norse mythology that happens around the Tumblr fandom that has solidified and has been a symbol of what Tumblr culture is. Like, you take Loki fandom on Tumblr, and that's what people think about when they think about Tumblr, I think. Yeah, Loki is a very Tumblr character. That's not all there is to him, but yeah, there is some of that. And there is like some of that playfulness in the comics, because like Kieran Gillen was on Tumblr a lot when Journey into Mystery was coming out, and he plays with that a lot in his run and like on Tumblr. And Ewing like was less so, but I think he was as well, quite on Tumblr and quite online when those comics were coming out. So like there's a bit of internet culture like infecting, quote unquote, those comics.
Yeah, I do really wonder about modern Tumblr. Like, here I am trying to promote a podcast as well as my first comic book later this year, and I'm like, I was never much of a Tumblrite. I'm like, do I need to get on there now?
Me neither. I came into Tumblr too late, I think, because like when I was like 14, 15, like that was the time, like in internet fandom, that was the time where everyone was on Tumblr, and I couldn't quite get it. I didn't understand how it worked. Like, I still quite don't feel like so old saying that. I don't get how Tumblr works. Like, I consumed Tumblr posts on Twitter in the same way like that now people consume TikTok videos on Instagram. What's the name? Instagram Shorts bits?
Reels, I think.
Reels, thank you. So like, I was that old person thing, but like when I was 14, so yeah, I never got into Tumblr culture, but yeah, feels like it was a big thing for my generation of internet fandom. Yeah, didn't quite get the clues there.
Yeah, I was in college during the Tumblr heyday, and like everyone at my table I'd usually sit at was into it. So like I just kind of got exposed secondhand to all their references, and like I'm not sure that was the best way, like the best sell on Tumblr, especially as like a huge comics person myself. I'd hear their little like shipping headcanons with Iron Man and Captain America, or like everything Loki related. And I'm like, oh, this is not what my comics are like at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing of Tumblr fandom, of comics characters, of like superhero comics characters. Like, it doesn't stick to like one interpretation of the character, and I think that's like really interesting. You get a kind of like cohesive version that melds up all those elements of like different versions, inspirations, and everything, especially with like characters from mythology. You get those elements added onto there as well, and makes for like, you're never quite sure, like, everyone's a fan of different aspects of the character in a way. Like, it's quite interesting. Like, that'd be something, if I'd had more time, I would have loved to delve into a bit more. Is like, how does that work? Like, how do you, because like it becomes part of your identity, or at least like your internet identity. And like, that's really interesting to me to study in a very like cold and mechanical way.
So for listeners of the show that aren't as familiar with Marvel Comics, or at least don't know Loki beyond like his MCU appearances, what can you tell us about these two series in particular, or this particular version of Loki, that makes them so significant compared to previous versions?
Yeah, I'm trying to craft the short version of the 58 pieces here. No, yeah, so Loki is created at the dawn of the Silver Age for Marvel, like when Marvel becomes this big, huge superhero thing in the 60s, starting with Fantastic Four #1. Like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko create, in a span of like 3 years, they create the Avengers, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Thor, Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Iron Man, etc. Like, the biggest names in Marvel. And in that list is Loki, who's created in Journey into Mystery. At the time, it's not quite Thor yet. It's still Journey into Mystery is the name of the magazine, the comic. Journey into Mystery number 83, I want to say. Oh, I don't have the numbers in my head. That looks bad. But like, the first appearance of Loki is him as like this pure, almost satanic supervillain opposing Thor. Thor is this like noble warrior, long blonde hair, flying like Superman, which isn't what Thor is like in mythology. He's more like this big redhead bearded warrior. Like, he's more of a brute in Norse mythology, where he's like more of a noble white knight in comics. And to oppose that, Loki in Marvel becomes this like pure evil satanic supervillain to oppose that nobility of Thor's. And he is that for the most part until 2010, when Kieran Gillen starts writing the character. So for the most part, from 1962 to 2010, Loki is just like pure supervillain. The only times where he's gonna fight side by side with Thor and like other superheroes, like when Asgard is threatened by a bigger threat, Because like Loki in comics, for the most part, doesn't want to destroy Asgard. He wants to control Asgard. He wants to be the All Father. He wants to replace Odin. And there's like whole how do you say that in English? Oedipal? Oedipal?
Oedipal.
Oedipal, thank you. Oedipal thing there with him wanting to kill his father and become king of Asgard, which is also a specificity of Marvel Comics. Is in Marvel Comics, Loki is the adopted son of Odin and adopted brother of Thor, which isn't the case at all in mythology. In mythology, from like the sources we have, he's a companion of Thor in some adventures, but his only familiar link to the other Norse gods is that he's the blood brother of Odin, which that is never explained what that means. He's just called that. But like, he's not the son of any gods, he's the son of giants. And yeah, so that specificity of Loki being a prince of Asgard, the son of Odin, is added by Lee and Kirby in Marvel Comics. And that's become like something that's interesting, is that's become an aspect of the character in other places in pop culture since. I think of like in Supernatural, he's the son of Odin. In like The Mask, the movies with Jim Carrey, Loki is the son of Odin. So yeah, that's the thing that Marvel Comics invented. That's not at all a thing in mythological sources. And so in 2010, Kieran Gillen writes a one-shot for the Siege event with a short story, essentially. At that time, Asgard is in Oklahoma in the United States. There is a war brewing between the United States government and Norman Osborn, who's leading the equivalent of S.H.I.E.L.D. at that time, and the Norse gods in Asgard in Oklahoma on American territory. And so there's war brewing, big fight between the superheroes, the American government, and the Norse gods. And in that event, Loki seems to sacrifice himself to save the world, which doesn't track for who Loki has been for the past 50 years at this point. So that's strange. Tying into that event, there's this one-shot, Siege Loki #1, written by Kieran Gillen, drawn by his current collaborator, Jamie McKelvey, with whom he's done Young Avengers at Marvel, but also The Wicked and the Divine at Image, which people might know. And in that comic, it's the first comic in Marvel continuity, because there had been other Loki series in 2000, but like in alternative world, there's one drawn by Esad Ribic that's incredible, that shows Loki winning, killing Odin and taking control of Asgard. That's like really, really beautiful in 4 issues. Highly recommend it. Another one that's like the Trials of Loki, that's just like exploring the mythological origins of Thor and Loki. But like Siege Loki is the first in continuity Earth since 616 Marvel comic that has Loki as a protagonist. And I think that's like really important to the start of Loki as this new character. Now he's the protagonist, and we're going to delve into his psychology, how he works. And Loki, essentially in Siege Loki, is just dissatisfied. He's tried this so many times, like trying to take control of Asgard, trying to be the supervillain, and it's just tiring. It doesn't work. So he's trying to do something new. And like, as a comic, it's a weird comic, because you don't quite know what Loki is trying to do. You just see him scheming with like trying to manipulate Mephisto, Hela, other big names of like mythology, and like he's kind of part of the Marvel universe, into doing something to save his soul and like escape from the promise of hell, of the afterlife he's supposed to go to once he dies. And essentially Siege Loki is about Loki trying to free himself from his destiny and trying to write his own destiny, which is going to be the central theme of the character going forward. It's about Loki being this very specific character that's at the crossroads between superhero fiction and mythology, and basically like walking those two worlds and being kind of aware that he is a creature of fiction, both as a mythological being and character in comics. Not quite in the way Deadpool knows he's a character of fiction, because that's like for laughs, for humor, and also like he fully knows he's in comics. Loki is never going to refer to the fact that he's in comics, but he knows he is a creature of fiction. And that means his fate is malleable, but also like subject to writing rules and narrative rules, not like realistic life rules, right? And so as Loki, the fact that Loki tries to escape his fate going forwards also means that Loki, the character, is trying to escape his fate of being a superhero character in a big license owned by a huge multinational corporation that this is Disney. Essentially, it's going to be a theme of writers trying to do what else can we do with these comics, with these characters, with these stories, and Loki is going to be like kind of the example of that, and the way writers, especially Karen Gillan and Al Ewing, try to do, okay, what else can we do with this? Which is like a great, ambitious question that I love. So yeah, essentially that's going to be the central driving factor of Loki post Siege Loki.
I really loved what I found in this book. Like, I want to say that I was blown away by both Young Avengers and maybe even more so Agent of Asgard, just of like how much they're like the right book for me right now, like how much they tackle ego death, and like also the main gripe of big two superhero comics of like constantly being pulled back to the status quo as mandated by some higher power, in this case Marvel editorial. But I'd love to know if like the process of writing this paper has at all changed the way that you view comics and comic book characters, or the way you read big two comics going forward.
I think so, yeah. It's definitely changed my view on, like, I think part of me was scared that by delving deeper and taking a more like research, university kind of cold approach to these comics, I'd like be turned off by them, or like find out things I don't like, or just like get exhausted by them. And that didn't happen, which I'm really glad about. I think it only deepened my enjoyment for them, and like also my understanding of what makes them so good. And yeah, I think it allowed me to take a step back from Marvel Comics. And I think like both this, writing this and also doing my Marvelous Year podcast, and like we read a lot of Marvel Comics every week, and that like after a while you're forced to like take a step back and be like, okay, what's interesting about this? Why am I Sisyphus on the hill reading and expecting to get a different outcome? And I think it's like, first of all, there are pearls in the middle of the boring, middle of the road comics that like are like the ocean of Marvel Comics. Most comics are boring. That's to be said, but that like there are pearls that like that I really want to get at what makes superhero comics good, what makes superhero stories interesting. Why do I personally like them? And I think something I realized is all superhero comics, I mean, something that I already kind of knew, but like fully realized with studying Loki, is all superhero comics have the potential of being queer. First of all, like there is to the core of superhero comics, and that doesn't track with every superhero, but that's like, if you imagine a superhero, they have a secret identity, and they have a superhero name that is different from their birth name, right? At the core of the superhero idea and narrative story fiction, there is the idea of someone that changes their identity at one point in their life and starts living a double life that they feel they can't admit or reveal to the people they care about and that are around them. That's insanely queer, right?
Yeah.
I think so. In 2023, I wrote both this thesis and an article for Comic Book Herald about the character Spider-Gwen in the Across the Spider-Verse movie, and about like her trans identity or what I read as her trans identity. And writing both of those things at the same time made me like really think about superhero comics as trans and queer stories overall. And I think that's something that you can't, I feel like writing comics in 2024, you have to know that, right? You have to realize, even if your comic doesn't include trans character, or like your main character isn't a trans or queer character, you have to get that there is a queer resonance to it, or there can be, and people are gonna read that into it. And I think that's something that's one direction that superhero comics like can be incredibly interesting. That's part of what makes Across the Spider-Verse so good to me. Is like, even if it doesn't feature any canonically trans character, it very much feels and read like a trans story.
Those like kind of trans identities or genderqueer identities in non-queer focused comics. There's a few notable examples of that I found that, like, I think this one's really going to piss off your co-host Dave, but Mark Millar's Kick-Ass is like,
ooh,
I revisited it a year or two ago, right as I was starting to like approach the trans community or like figure this out about myself.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, it reads as incredibly gay and or trans. Like if you just replace the superhero outfit with being in drag or like a femme presentation or any kind of like queer public presentation, like there's a very kind of parallel theme with that character, like, you know, the dangers of it, getting like assaulted on the street because he's in a superhero costume. And it just feels like, oh yeah, if you just replaced superheroics with like a drag performance, this is, and like going viral because of it. Like this feels like the drag queen origin story. Just it's
that's
Kick-Ass.
really interesting. I haven't read Kick-Ass, and knowing what I know about Mark Miller, I can't imagine that was intentional.
Oh no, yeah.
But that's super interesting. Yeah, like, 'cause like sometimes super comics are so straight they become queer. If that makes sense, because like. Yeah. Some writers of super comics are like so outside of anything queer related, like of that knowledge and ideas that like they don't realize what they're reading is incredibly queer. It's like when writers write like to made friendship and makes it so straight that it becomes gay. I don't think it's Dave you're gonna piss off with that. Rather be Mark Miller and his fans. I think that's a really interesting reading. Yeah.
The main character of Kick-Ass even talks about like how empowered he feels wearing it under his clothing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's trans. That's egg behavior right there.
Discuss, yeah. And yeah, with the character of Loki, I think something that's interesting is a character that in the context of Marvel Comics has existed for now more than 60 years. And for most of that character's life, it's been fully supervillain, very masculine, or like very binary at least, idea of villainy, and also like the ways when that character is feminine, it's seen as like a crime, essentially. That's something that happens in the 2000s in James Straczynski's run. I don't want to attribute anything to that writer because I don't know his political opinions, and it could very much be an accidental thing of someone not being like aware of trans issues and stuff. But in that comic, Loki takes the appearance of Sif. He essentially like steals her body and like walks around in a dead woman's body for most of that comic, and like for most of the life of Loki, like Loki is considered as a male character, and when Loki has a female appearance, that's Loki like impersonating someone or like committing a crime of gender transgression, kind of. That's the way it reads, which reads like very transphobic, right? But I also think it's also the comic not thinking about trans issues in the way that could be read. It's just like full sci-fi idea of just like someone who can change their appearance. Like that's what Loki is. That's the way Loki's gender fluidity is interpreted, which, like, to be fair, in Norse mythology, let's not pretend like Loki having female attributes is considered like a cool thing. It's very much a way that the character is made fun of in mythology, at least from what we know from the very few sources we have. But like in 2024, it's hard to write a character that like is transgressive of gender rules and how that be a bad thing without being someone I don't really necessarily want to read, right? So what, especially Al Ewing, because Kieran Gillen doesn't do that much of it, so just like Loki wearing nail polish in the Young Avengers, but like with Al Ewing in Loki Agent of Asgard and later Defenders Beyond and currently Immortal Thor, you see Loki being like purely queer, being gender fluid, switching their appearance and their pronouns like in equal manner from the end of the run of Loki Agent of Asgard, and like taking the care of having sci-fi and superhero ideas of the way a god can escape their cosmic destiny, having that and intentionally giving it a aura, a theme of, well, what actual real life feeling does that channel, right? What does that mean for real people? Because that's like, stories are about real people even when they're about like fantasy superhero stuff, and having that link to the real world, having that weight to it is really important. I think that's something especially Al Ewing is really good at, giving real world social issues weight to superhero fun stories. And I think like at the core of the character of Loki, especially in Loki Agent of Asgard, Defenders Beyond, and now Immortal Thor, there is that queerness that is like fully intermingled with ideas of like cosmos and mythology and stuff.
Later in Agent of Asgard, when like that was something I really resonated with personally. Like Loki has his ego death that they've been building to all through the book, and once they're on the other side of it, she's depicted as much more gender fluid in their expression. Like every couple panels, they switch from a male to female presentation. And like, I mean, that's what happened to me. I had an ego death, and then I came out of it and like started being way more androgynous, and that led to like the proper transition. So like, I love how well they tackle like the sense of queerness, and I know that's not unique to me. I've met a lot of people that like some kind of ego death, sometimes psychedelic assisted, has been a big factor in that new expression. But like with this being, I mean, probably both you and I, like one of our favorite parts of the character and their modern depiction, like, was this hard not to make an even larger focus of your paper?
I mean, there's definitely part of me that just wanted to talk about Loki's queerness, the themes of ego death, and how the character evolves in a very gender fluid queer way. I think that's a different paper and maybe a less literally accepted classic paper. That's something I could write if I kept going with those studies for a little bit. I think that's really interesting. Like you talked to me about that by message, and like I don't think I considered it that much while like I tackled ego death in my essay in a different part than I tackle Loki's queerness, and I think I didn't necessarily had made that link between the two. But I think that's something that's incredibly interesting, is that Loki's among the many aspects of Loki that change when he goes through ego death in this comic. So like you get at least 5 or 6 different iterations of Loki throughout the 2010s and now 2020s. And each time he goes through, a type of ego death that, like, I use that phrase because it's literally said in Loki Agent of Asgard. There is many times the words ego death is coming to you, I think, something like that, that is repeated throughout the comic. And it's, in the comic, it means like it means that the way Loki is currently can't last, that like change is coming to you, and change is a type of death. And I think that's the main theme of Loki throughout the 2010s and like in current Marvel comics. And the way that resonates with the character of Loki being queer and the idea of, well, the person you are when you transition, when you have that realization about yourself, is the same person, but also not. And that's at the core of Loki here. That's something that's really, really interesting. I mean, the words ego death come, I think, from the study of psychedelics. Like, that's where it originates from. And I don't think that's meaningless. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, that's like something that's really interesting about the way Al Ewing proposes Loki as a way to progress superhero comics and allow that idea of change in them, is like he makes that ego death and regeneration process a core part of the character. Like the way I read it is almost Doctor Who-like, of like the character is gonna regenerate once in a while, just like to keep things fresh, to keep things interesting, and to refresh the character, and not have stories and characters stagnate. And I think that's incredibly interesting. And like you see, as soon as Al Ewing is done with Loki Agent of Asgard, the characters goes mostly into the hands of Jason Aaron and his run on Thorpe post from 2015 to 2018, something like that. And you get a Loki in that, but that doesn't quite track with the Loki of Al Ewing. That Loki is fully male for the most part, like only uses he, him pronouns, and has like masculine, like he looks like a younger version of Tom Hiddleston essentially, and goes back to being more nefarious, more villainous, while also melding aesthetic and thematic aspects of what Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing added to the character, and also what Tom Hiddleston in the MCU added to the character. But like you see that there's it goes back to basics in a way. In going back to basics, it loses that queerness, what makes the character more interesting. And I think that's ego death is a really interesting idea to add to superhero comics as a whole, and like to a form of storytelling that spans decades and like hundreds, if not thousands, of different books, like a universe that is a fictional universe that is absolutely huge. If you want to make those characters stay interesting, they're gonna have to change, and sometimes in radical ways. And it's not gonna make sense if you read the same character in 2024 and in 1964, because like those are the same characters, but also not. And I think the idea of ego death and inserting that idea of change and revolution almost as like an integral part of superhero comics, of like it's gonna need to renew itself. I think that's a great idea. That's something superhero comics absolutely need, and that's something like you see with, I mean, even arguing on Immortal Hulk, the current X-Men era, Krakoa era of X-Men in Marvel Comics. Those are big themes of that as well, and I think that's a tendency I see more and more, especially in Marvel, is like that idea of writers writing superhero comics about superhero comics and about what they can be. And I think especially Defenders Beyond, which is the last comic I treat in my paper, especially talks literally about that. Defenders Beyond is very much a comic about Marvel Comics and about what Marvel Comics can be. And it's very metatextual and ethereal, strange comic that I really love. Yeah, I think ego death is something that I mean, I feel like maybe if there was one thing I wish I'd had more time to tackle and see in that essay, it'd be that, both ego death and queerness, and like what that means for Loki and for superhero comics in general.
That metatextual nature of the book, like, I mean, Agent of Asgard literally starts with Loki's mission being to retcon his story, like, you know, these coming to terms.
That magic is fiction. Magic is telling a story so good.
Narrative magic.
That's a great phrase.
Yeah, like he's literally going about like changing his history and like accepting this whole nature of like he's the product of all the stories that are told about them. And I know from your coverage of earlier Thor adjacent comics on My Marvelous Hero, like going back to Thor Disassembled, like, oh, it seems like this has kind of been the corner of Marvel's universe where they can get this meta about the nature of being like fictional characters or like gods, like in the Norse mythological sense, but also gods in the way like we treat superheroes like gods.
Yeah, that's something interesting about having mythological figures in a universe that is a super universe, that is a fantasy / sci-fi universe, that you have two ways of going about it. You have the way of treating them like essentially just aliens that humans interpreted as gods, which is like the quote-unquote easier but like pure sci-fi way, which is what the MCU does, at least at the beginning. You have a whole speech between Thor and Jane Foster in the first Thor movie about Thor explaining that, like, no, basically we're just like strong immortal aliens, and like we use Einstein-Rosen bridges is what the Bifrost is, like using real life, I mean, quote unquote real life science explanations for mythological stuff and like trying to make that fit our understanding of the world. And the other way is, well, there isn't such a thing as mythological canon, right? Mythology is about belief, and it's also about like having an infinity of different versions of the same characters, and you can't reconcile that because mythology is stories that live in the heads of everyone, and that doesn't track with what IP is, intellectual property, which is what superheroes are, at least at Disney and Warner Bros. So yeah, you have that idea of, well, what these characters are gods. What does that mean? Well, what is that? Do you like, you don't get much of people worshipping the Asgardians in Marvel Comics, but you do get them not having history that makes sense, right? Even more so than other Marvel characters. Like, other Marvel characters are like Iron Man. When he starts off, he's like, he gets his powers in the Vietnam War, I think, essentially. At least like in East Asia. And in nowadays, he gets it like in the Middle East, in Afghanistan or Iraq, like depending on what year you're reading comics. So like, yeah, there are things that don't make sense and are updated. With the Asgardians and mythological characters in Marvel Comics, it's like, it depends on what kind of mythological stories the writers want to adapt. Odin, like, is a character that in Norse mythology, one of his cornerstone traits is he has only one eye. And that's like a big thing of the way he obtained knowledge, the secret of the runes and everything. In Marvel Comics, from the 1960s to the 2000s, Odin is drawn with two eyes. And when he starts being drawn with one eye, there's not a story that explains it. It's just like, oh, we actually realized that's a thing in mythology, so we started doing it, right? And there's a lot of that, of just, well, that wasn't a thing up until now in comics, but it's kind of a thing in some mythological stories, so why not do it? And so you get quite a bit of mythological characters being like, having different versions of their own story and being like, well, how did that happen? It's like, who knows? That's the way they work. Like, their past and their life and their truth is kind of muddy, because that's how myth works. That's how gods work, because they're creature of fiction. And it's really interesting that in the context of Marvel Comics, they're creature of fiction even more than the other creatures of fiction from their fictional universe. And that's like a great context to write stories about fiction.
On that note of being like characters that are made of stories, like this also came at a good time for me, like both these comics, because I've been at a point where I'm looking into this concept of narrative magic that like Loki's very directly tapping into. Like, I'm on a bit of a Grant Morrison kick. I'm reading The Invisibles, and that tackles this a lot. And I mean, writers like Grant Morrison and Phil K. Dick both write about how their writing goes on to shape their lives, and like they therefore turn themselves into a product of story. And like, I can only imagine how hard it has to shape one's sense of reality if like you are the type to write yourself into a story.
Yeah.
And then like if you're writing about things like alien abductions, and then you experience an alien abduction, and then you have the spiral of, did that happen just because, or did that happen because I wrote or will write about that?
Yeah.
And like how that story shapes even real life senses of self. And I think it's put best in this book in Dr. Doom's speech in one of the early issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which,
yeah.
Side note, but Google Translate was how I read your paper since it was written in French. But they sometimes translated it to Dr. Fatalis. And I'm like, that's a really good name.
That's an interesting thing. There are a lot of French translations of Marvel characters that like have stayed the same since the 60s and 70s. And so you get stuff like Dr. Doom. Doom doesn't quite make sense as a French word. Like in English, you get like, it's doom. It's something that's tragic. It's fate. In French, like doom, doom, doom. That's what it sounds like. So instead they replace it with fatalis, which is like fatality. You get the idea. You get kind of the same idea, but with a different word. So yeah, in French, Dr. Doom is Dr. Fatalis. And you get other names changed that doesn't quite make sense. Like She-Hulk in French is Miss Hulk. You could have kept She-Hulk. That's kind of weird, Miss Hulk. Yeah, it's weird. You get plenty of stuff like that, of weird translations of more characters. And some of them that like are translated in like that were translated in the comics and still are nowadays, but in the movies they're not, because like in the 2000s and 2010s, like French people have a better sense of English and like what English words mean. So like if you watch the MCU movies in French, the Avengers are called the Avengers, but if you read the comics, they're called les Vengeurs. Vengeurs, the French word, which is a translation of Avenger. It's like in comics, you have a lot of English names of characters that are translated, and sometimes like some that are translated and some that aren't. So like the Falcon and the Winter Soldier show is called in French, it's Le Falcon and Le Soldat de l'Hiver. So one is translated, but the other is not, which is like weird. But yeah, there's a lot of different names in French, including Dr. Fatalis, which is Dr. Doom.
If you ever find yourself writing Marvel Comics someday, like if you somehow get to make that path, I'd love to see you tackle these same concepts of like, okay, story and narrative magic is what makes these characters real, but like what happens when they have to confront like, oh, but other cultures know you by a different name, and how does that shape you as a character
that's
and identity?
I mean, that's something if I were to write a Marvel comic, I'd love to make it non-American for once. Like, why is it that there's only superheroes in America, right? And seeing what superheroes look like in different cultures, but also like from the point of view of different cultures. In Marvel Comics, you see like Chinese superheroes, Russian superheroes, but they're very much like Chinese and Russian superheroes from the point of view of the US and what the US imagines Russian or Chinese superheroes would be. I think I'd be really interested in superhero comics, like Marvel giving the reins to like European creators, African creators, Asian creators to write stories in their own country, but also in their own like country style of comics, right? About comics from those places. Like, I'd love to read a Marvel manga by a Japanese mangaka about Japanese superheroes in Marvel Universe. And like, same from European comics about European superheroes, African comics about African superheroes. Like, that'd be like, I give Black Panther to an actual African writer, please. Like, it'd be great because like Black Panther and Wakanda are like some of the best ideas in Marvel Comics, but they're also very much a American idea. And the like Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he writes Black Panther in the 2010s, very much writes it about racism and being black in the United States. And I'd be really interested in a comic about Black Panther and Wakanda in the context of Africa and African politics, African society, and stuff like that. Marvel comics, surprisingly, are very American centered, and I'd love for that to like get expanded a bit more. Yeah, how did we start talking about this?
I did the side tangent on Doctor Doom being called Dr. Fatalis.
Oh, yeah.
Which brings us back to that speech I wanted to touch on here, but as he puts
I need to find it. Can I please read it? I love
Okay, I wrote it out to read it, but I will let you do the honors here.
Oh, perfect. I need to find it first. Give me a second.
1 second. Let me send it in the chat here for you.
Thank you so much. Notes. I love dramatic reading, and especially reading Doctor Doom is a pleasure. If magical thinking is the assumption of a high narrative of the flow of events, then true magic is an imposition of narrative upon reality. It is telling a story to the world and making the world believe it. The dark work of police and politicians, of rulers and tricksters. And if magic is narrative, then to be a creature of magic, to be a god, is to be a creature of story, yes? Love it. I love it. Al Ewing is a very underappreciated Doctor Doom writer.
Yeah, I want Immortal Doom so bad after just that one issue in here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm glad he's on Thor because I'm hoping that means some kind of real continuation. As you've mentioned, I didn't know that until this episode that we do indeed get that, which great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Immortal Doom is done by, like, I think that's just makes sense as a next major character. Like, I don't need to see him do Iron Man or Spider-Man. Like, let him have Doom. He gets this character so clearly.
I mean, I'm going to be quick about it, but like, I have a great pitch for the Immortal Iron Man. Like, that's something I'd love to see Ewing do, because like, Iron Man is a character that's never quite as interesting and fun as you think he's gonna be in comics. Like, he's not the big fun Robert Downey Jr. character from the movies. He's like a more blended version of that. And like, there aren't many like classic great Iron Man stories in the comics. And I think like doing something like Al Ewing thinks about immortality in the context of cosmic horror and the horror of immortality in Immortal Hulk. In Immortal Thor, it's very much about like immortality as like a mythical idea about like cosmic beings and fiction and mythological ideas. And I'd love to see him do something about immortality as like about transhuman stuff and like the man in the machine artificial intelligence. Like that'd be a great way to put the immortal thing with Iron Man.
Yeah, like what if Tony Stark becomes such a like well-known billionaire? Like he's got like his whole Elon Musk vibe of the Marvel Universe. So, like there is always going to be not just an Iron Man, but someone that's willing to clone you once that becomes a possibility. So you have to accept that.
That's something I think like the core problem of like one of the core problems of Iron Man is like it's a billionaire you're rooting for. That's hard to do. Yeah. Like I think Al Ewing could do really interesting stuff with that. Like questioning, like going to the core of the character and being like, wait, is it a good thing that he's a billionaire, and would it actually make him better if he gave up his fortune? Like, what does that look like? That's also interesting. I think there's plenty of interesting stories to be done with Iron Man, and I just haven't seen many of them. But yeah, the tangent's over.
Now, I do think we should touch on Loki season 2 specifically, or just Loki as a series, because I do feel like Loki season 2 tackles a lot of the same ideas of Agent of Asgard, just with that more sci-fi flair. Like, it's less like he's dealing with the nature of being like a creature of myth, but like, I mean, in season 1, we see him watching the MCU movies, basically, and responding to himself as a character and, like, changing because of that. And, like, it's him coming to grips with this idea and, like, how he can be better and, like, how there are different versions of him. So there are all these better possibilities of Loki. And I'd love to know how you feel about how Loki on Disney Plus, like, how it tackles a lot of these same ideas that Ewing and Gillen were getting at.
Yeah, I think the Loki as a series is very strange. The Loki of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is, I think, one of the most interesting characters in the MCU. Like, he has a trajectory from the first Thor movie to being the bad guy in Avengers, and then to having that, like, kind of strange redemption arc throughout Thor 2 and 3. That's, like, really interesting. But, like, is never as interesting as, at least to me, as the character in the comics. It feels more like, it's more straightforward. It doesn't tackle much ideas of like myth and stuff, but also because that's not what the Thor stories were in the MCU for the most part. And I think I had the same opinion about the first season, while still finding it to be like, I think probably my favorite thing in the MCU is the first season of Loki. I think it's like very fun sci-fi story with at its core an interesting idea for what that character is, the trajectory of the character, but also like not dealing about those ideas of dealing with the idea of change for the character, but not in the context of the comics, of talking about fiction in fiction, about myth and everything. So it felt to me kind of like a more bland version of what happens to comics and more straightforward again. But I really love the first season. The second season is a strange one. It starts off really, really good to me.
Yeah, I love that first episode.
Yeah, and then it gets into like weird Kang, not even Kang, but like Victor Timely shenanigans, and Jonathan Majors, like, even outside of everything going on with Jonathan Majors in the real world, Jonathan Majors giving the weirdest performance as like a comic book character, a cartoon character, but it's not a cartoon character. Those episodes are very, very weird in the middle, and that portion I don't quite... It felt very strange. And then it ends on like 2 great episodes to me. One episode where he's like going through time uncontrollably and trying to assemble the different people that don't remember him and that have found their original lives. And that's a great episode.
And they even get to it of like, you're facing not a science problem, but a fiction problem. And like, that's where it's starting to get really at the meat of this.
And then the final episode I really, really do like as well, and gets more into giving him a less realistic sci-fi ending and more of like a thematically resonant, strange ending when he becomes kind of like this god at the end of time, tying all stories, all lives together.
And shaped like Yggdrasil, like he's on the tree now.
I really like this series as a whole in the context of the MCU especially. I think it's one of the most interesting things in the MCU. I still think by the end of it, it feels like a lesser version of the comics. The first season doesn't quite deal with the ideas of the god of stories and all that from the comics. It gets at the idea of change for the character in different ways, with time travel, essentially, basically. And the second season, and the first season has like some aesthetic nods to the works I treated in my paper, especially like having the character of Kid Loki there, but it has nothing to do with the Kid Loki of the comic. He's just like another Loki that happens to be a kid. And also like very little queerness in the MCU's Loki, like kind of one-off nod to him being bi or pansexual, and then having like a female version of Loki, but it's Loki from a different universe. It's like kind of a weird way to not have queerness in your thing. Like, we're gonna have your female Loki, but it's not gonna be queer in any way, shape, or form, which is a bit disappointing. But yeah, I think the second season, especially towards the end, gets a bit more to those ideas of the god of stories, of mythical fictional ideas, but doesn't quite merit that, doesn't quite like treats that in any way earlier in the comic. So it feels a bit like, oh, that's what you like in the comics, so we're gonna do a bit of that. But I do like it, and I am glad that it's in the movies. So it works, but it's not. I definitely don't think it's as interesting as what happens in the comics.
Yeah. Now seeing Loki on the world tree at the end, like,
yeah, that's
that kind
a great
of
visual.
Left me with this idea, like, now that Al Ewing is writing Thor and has control of like the mainline Norse mythology book and Loki, and we see this relation with Odin, and like they mention them as blood brothers, but like what does that mean? And we see like Loki even in Odin's early history with some of the time travel shenanigans with King Loki. How would you feel if like the eventual reveal is that Loki and Odin are the same person? Or like that's what this blood brother thing is. There's like Loki is the Odin at the end of time, or like the version that like has to then craft his own story and like needs to kick off the Norse mythology saga in general.
So that's a super interesting thing of Norse mythology is first of all, we don't know much about Loki. Loki's a very mysterious character in Norse mythology. And one of the theories about where Loki comes from, what he is he might have initially been an aspect of Odin that throughout the years, throughout the decades, the centuries, became a independent character in Norse mythos. But it's very possible that originally Loki was just like one aspect of Odin, because in Norse mythology, so in the comics, Odin is very much just like God the Father, Zeus being. He's like this great authoritative figure that's like a very patriarchal, almost imperialistic thing. In Norse mythology, Odin he's the king of the gods. He is like the leading figure in the mythology, but in the pantheon, he's also a trickster. He is a god of knowledge. He is a god of magic, of mystery. He's the god that has the knowledge of the runes. He's more mischievous and trickstery than in the comics. And in that way, that's way closer to Loki. And like something I talk about towards the end of my paper is my theory of my view of the character is towards the end of Loki's arc under the writing of Al Ewing, Loki becomes an adaptation of the mythical figure of Loki as much as the mythical figure of Odin, because he gets those aspects of being the god of stories, the god of magic, the god of fiction, which is a thing that Odin doesn't have in the Marvel Universe, so Loki can get that, can be that part of Norse myth and that pantheon. I think, talking about it literally in terms of Loki being Odin, that's a fun idea. That's a fun theory. I don't know if I see that quite working, especially if with like, I'd be really interested in you reading Immortal Thor, the current issue that are out, because it does some really, really interesting things about what the gods are, what the Asgardians are, and what do they mean and what's above the Asgardians in interesting ways. But I think thematically, you're definitely getting at somewhere there with like the idea of Loki in the Marvel Universe currently taking on some aspects of the mythological figure of Odin, which is something Al Ewing does directly in Loki of Asgard. You see in a dream that Loki has, you see a version of Odin that looks and behaves much more like the mythological Odin than the Marvel Comics Odin.
And affirms Loki, I'll add. Like, that was pretty cool. Accepting that Odin.
So I feel like there is kind of a symbolic passing of the baton there of like comics Loki taking on aspects of comics Odin.
Now, like, with Al Ewing back in control of Loki, like, where would you personally like to see the character go from here?
I think so. At the end of Defenders Beyond, which, by the way, high recommendation on the Defenders miniseries and Defenders Beyond, which is its sequel, that Al Ewing did at Marvel in 2022, 2023.
I started Avengers Beyond, or Defenders Beyond yesterday, and I was so sad I couldn't read it all before this episode, but I'm loving it so far. So
it's written by Al Ewing, drawn by very bad Spanish accent Javier Rodriguez, and it's about the Defenders being assembled by some kind of like tarot spell that isn't like, it's very mystical and cosmic, and it's dealing with Marvel Comics as a universe and dealing with the different dimensions of Marvel Comics as like fiction, And so talking about the limits of fiction, talking about what it is to be a character in the prison of fiction. It's very weird and out there, but in ways that I love. And the art is incredible. Javier Rodriguez is awesome at doing those like very cosmic beings and like universes that like, I mean, it took me twice reading it to quite get what was going on. It's strange, but in a way you can follow. And I think that's like very, very much helps by the art.
Feels like very much like a modern use of Jack Kirby style artwork in moments without trying to be like, without just aping that style. Like I've seen others do, of just trying to draw like him and stuff. Like, what would Jack Kirby's art look like if he had modern tools?
Yeah, it's very evocative of like what you imagine as classic superhero art, while being very modern in its coloring. Like it's very modern colors. It's done on computer, right? But it's great art. And the end of that series has Loki considering escaping from the fictional world and like freeing herself from the chains of fiction and continuity and the rules of IP in the Marvel Universe to escape to a higher plane, but chooses not to after being convinced by Blue Marvel, which is another really interesting character, to make a Bodhisattva vow. I'm sure I'm pronouncing this very, very wrong, but it's an idea from Buddhism, I think, of like someone who achieves, I'm very sorry if like enlightenment, yeah, but chooses not to reach nirvana and chooses to stay on Earth to help everyone else attain nirvana and enlightenment. And Alwyn ties that to like a way more like political and social idea, and with a quote from, I don't know the name, but like from a socialist American politician from the 20th century that says essentially like, as long as one person isn't free, I am not free. As long as one person is in prison, I am in prison. Like essentially having that idea of Loki cannot be free if everyone else isn't free. And Loki making the vow of freeing essentially every other character in the Marvel Universe from their chains of fiction, which to me reads as like an incredibly ambitious thing from Al Ewing of being like, yeah, as the writer, I'm gonna try to free Marvel characters from their chains. Like that's an ambition I love from superhero writers. And so Loki gets that's the guiding words of Loki going forwards. And we've seen a little bit of that, but not quite as much in Immortal 4 for now. But I think that's going to be somewhere. I really hope that's something Al Ewing is going to continue to pursue and see what that means. Like, what is Loki going to actually do to try and attain that? And I think that's going to be that's probably going to be a big part of Immortal Thor, because like that series is dealing already with ideas of fiction, of myth. So yeah, I'm really excited to see where Al Ewing goes with the character next.
I'd love to see someone pick up on this. Like, I think Deadpool would be an ideal character for like a crossover doing this, but instead, like, what if we saw this narrative creature Loki dealing with a post Marvel Comics version of a Marvel character, like a self-aware one like Deadpool, or even just a standard hero, but like they're dealing with, in our world, something has happened that comics aren't published anymore. Maybe there's been some kind of apocalypse, but this character still exists because there is still stories of Deadpool or Spider-Man, or like there's still people making these action figures. That's help them make peace with that. Yeah,
that's something that's like people in fandom and in pop culture all often associate the idea of superheroes with myth and talk about like superheroes as like modern myth, which like is an idea that has its problems, definitely, but that is interesting to discuss and talk about, I think. And like, yeah, it'd be interesting to see talking about those creatures of fiction in a world where they are basically myth or like are fiction, but also kind of real. That's really interesting. Yeah. I think Deadpool is an interesting character because I've never read a Deadpool comic that I love, but like I can definitely see, I have like this half-formed pitch in my head of a Deadpool Doctor Doom comic, because like Doctor Doom is this highly ambitious, egotistical, like, I am the best person in the world and I'm the only person that can save the world, but also saving the world also means that the world is under my foot. And this very self-serious person, and that's very like also mythical and magical and stuff. And then Deadpool, who's just a guy who hates himself and has no sense of ambition or being egotistical, or he's just like, just a guy who's like, I mean, to me, Deadpool is kind of the opposite of, in every way, of Doctor Doom. And that's an interesting thing to brush again. And like, one that's like fully opposite of Doctor Doom, but also is a master of the fourth wall and of the limit between reality and fiction. So it's like, that's an interesting idea that I'd love to see someone tackle.
Now, there's a question I wanted to make sure I got to ask you before you go.
Yeah.
And it's about another mythological hero that I think may be even closer to your heart than Loki himself. And that's Percy Jackson.
Hell yeah. Finally, welcome to my Percy Jackson year. I'm hijacking this podcast.
Let's do it.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. How are you feeling about the Disney Plus series?
I am feeling great, and I wasn't expecting to. Percy Jackson is a series that, is very near and dear to my heart. Children's book series that I read growing up, loved. The writer of Percy Jackson wrote other series in the same universe dealing with Roman gods, Egyptian gods, Norse gods as well. There is a version of Loki in the Percy Jackson universe. And that had like terrible movies in the 2010s.
Yeah.
Absolutely garbage, god-awful movies. And the writer like talked to Disney, which publishes the book and now has the rights to the books, to try and do a show and like have some say over what like how the books are adapted into a show. And the series is currently airing on Disney Plus, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, season 1. That's adapting the first book, The Lightning Thief. And so, to be fully fair, I love the Percy Jackson books and the others of Rick Riordan's mythical books. Like, not everything has aged super well, and they're very much like children's books. Like, don't expect to get into them at age 35 and like love them. Or like, if you're an adult that isn't really necessarily interested in reading comics, in reading children's books, probably not for you. But they still have like a big place in my heart and like are a huge part of why I love, like, what I love in fiction and what I'd love to write myself someday. And the TV show is really interesting because I was expecting it to be good, but I was expecting it to be like very straight up adaptation of the book without changing anything. Because like it felt like the writer was very much burnt on the earlier movie adaptations and would like to like just have it stay absolutely the same. And it felt like a lot of the fans, that's what they wanted to, which like is fun, but I think I'm less interested in watching a one-to-one adaptation than I am in just rereading the books. And I think the series has, like, what the series has changed from the books, it's been for the better and to make it like feel like a tighter stories and also like more in line with writing a story in the 2020s rather than in 2005, like actualizing some aspects of it. Like I think the relationship between Percy and his mother is really interesting in the show. Like Percy in the book is a bit more eager to, like, not quite eager, but like thinks about his dad as much as he thinks about his mom, his dad being Poseidon, the Greek god, and his mom just being like a normal human woman named Sally Jackson. But in the book, it's like, no, everything he's doing, it's for his mom. It's to save his mom. Like that's the one thing he cares about because she's the one person that's been there for him. And that relationship is really cool to me. And like having the mom also be an actual character, fully like full character, that's just not just the damsel in distress has been cool. And also like just, yeah, the story has been made tighter. I think like the actors are really, really good. The actress that plays Annabeth, one of the main characters, is incredible. And yeah, I think it's really cool to see those very young actors and see them at a stage where it's like, okay, this might make them big. And I think like seeing hints of like, oh, these might be great actors someday. Yeah, and I think it's really cool that they decided to adapt to have actual child actors play 12-year-olds instead of 20-year-old actors playing the parts of like 20-year-old characters, but that behave like 12-year-olds in the movies, which was a whole thing. Yeah, I really like, I mean, it's still like it is a kind of like blockbuster Disney show. Like, don't expect high art or high TV from it, but it's a fun time. And I think like if you have kids that like mythology or stuff, it's a great show. It's a great show to watch, I think.
Now, I didn't ever read the later series of Percy Jackson. Like, I was in middle school when they started coming out, and read those original 5 books, loved them. And like, it was more my thing. Like, I was a Percy Jackson kid rather than a Harry Potter kid. Like, it seemed more successful.
Same.
And like, does that make me better than the people that were raised on Harry Potter? I would say probably. But like, by the time the second series came out, I started to see through the formula. I was growing out of young adult novels in high school. But like, do the later like wider universe books ever tackle any of these same ideas of like, what are the gods, or like creatures of narrative, anything like that?
A bit, but it's never the core part of the series. I think the gods in Percy Jackson are more nebulous than in most Marvel comics, but less so than in most Loki comics. I think like the sequel series to Percy Jackson is Heroes of Olympus, and that has Roman gods, but that are like, they're not fully different things from the Greek gods. There's like kind of a different aspects of the same entity thing going on there. So there is like, a bit of that, of gods being not quite just like immortal aliens. Like, they behave in ways that don't quite make sense, and they don't behave like normal people. Like, you feel that there are entities that have been around for thousands of years and like aren't quite rational because of it. There's a bit of that there, but it doesn't quite delve into those existential themes as Gun and Ewing do.
I remember kid me was like, this is stupid. Why would people be going to war over like having a different aspect of the same general being as your belief system? And God, I was naive, but I still think that's a pretty stupid thing to go to war about.
That makes you think of some of the stuff that hasn't aged well in Percy Jackson. Is the war between the Greeks and the Romans is supposed to originate, or like the American Civil War is supposed to be part of that. Which is like, okay, not sure what you're doing there. And like, I think the Romans are supposed to be the Southerners in that camp. I was like, I don't know if I want my Roman demigod heroes to have been on the side of the South in the Civil War. And the same thing with in the Greek gods, like the big 3 gods, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, stopped having demigod children after World War II, because World War II was a conflict between the children of Poseidon and Zeus on the Allies side and the children of Hades on the Nazi side, which, okay, not great. I have children of Hades characters that I love in those comics, and like, that doesn't quite, like, tying purely fantasy stuff to real world tragedies and very like grave events, not a great idea, right, Crichton? That there's some of that there. And also like, it's very American centered, and talking about the reason why the Greek gods are now in America is because of like the great idea of Western civilization traveling from Greece to Rome and then to Europe and now to the US, and the US now being the lighthouse of American civilization, of Western civilization. It's a bit weird reading that in 2024. There's a bit of like weird propaganda-ish stuff there. That's not in the show. It feels very much like one of those things the writer looked at and like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have written that back then, and I'm not gonna write that now when I have the chance of doing something different, which is nice.
Now, just kind of bringing things to a close here, Charlotte, do you think there's any chance an English translation of this dissertation will ever make it onto the internet?
Yeah, that's something we didn't talk about. I wrote this in French because I am French and I study in French.
What?
I'd love to translate it into English. Because like, I know plenty of people who'd be at least interested in reading it. 2 things there. First of all, it takes a lot of time, and I'm currently both working at a bookshop and still continuing to like my studies at university. I'm like doing an apprenticeship at a bookshop to become a bookseller. And so like, that takes a lot of my time with the podcast on top of that. That's like, I have very busy weeks. So like, I need to find the time to do that, but maybe this summer, we'll see. And the other thing is, I have to resist the instinct of whilst translating it, starting to write it again, rewriting it, right? That's like a hard instinct to kick, like to not do. So I'll have to restrain myself, because I know once I try like once I start switching some sentences and reworking some paragraphs, I'm off to start rewriting it from the beginning, which I shouldn't do. I don't have the time to do that, so I need to kick that instinct. But yeah, I really, really want to do that at some point.
I will say Google Translate did a really good job with it. Like,
it might be a good start, yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't used Google Translate in a few years, but I think they've really advanced with that. So I think it gives you a starting point. You could knock out, like, if not in a day, within a week or so.
But it's not that long. It's like the actual essay is 48 pages, something like that. So like writing, like translating a page a week, I could do that in a year. So that's doable. But yeah, I have to find the time to do that.
Charlotte, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on my show. I'm glad you were able to come on here as well as Giant Size Violence. So thank you again for making the time to come talk about your paper and sharing that here. As for our listeners, if they'd like to hear more of your thoughts on comics, where can they find you?
You can find me on the My Marvelous Year podcast, on every feed on Spotify, on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, etc. You can find me on the Extra Issues podcast, which is the podcast I do with my MMY co-host Zach, about like essentially every comic we want to talk about. We started with a theme on superhero subversions, Watchmen, Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, which is like another Kieran Gillen comic about superheroes and fiction at the same time. That's like, and about Watchmen and the impact of Watchmen on comics, which is really interesting. Highly recommend Peter Cannon Thunderbolt if you're at all interested in superhero comics. Then we did a theme on Marinox Ostertag, who is a writer of YA, like young adults and teenager comics. The Girl from the Sea and the Boy Witch trilogy are her most well-known works. And she's also worked on the Owl House animated show for Disney. Like,
I'd like to say,
cool artist.
Fans of this show, absolutely check out their Molly Knox Ostertag episodes, because they're very much in the same vein, and like another great trans writer that like I'll want to look into someday on this show.
Yeah, I don't think Molly Knox Ostertag is trans. She's queer, but I think her husband, and Nate Stevenson, is a trans writer who was a co-creator of She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, the animated show for Netflix. But I'm pretty sure Molly Knox Ostertag is cis.
Oh, okay. My bad. Yeah, I just Googled it and I am mistaken. I think just the, like, how cool some of the trans themes in her work are. Like, especially, like, Witch Boy. I'm like, oh, they must be. Which does bring me to the point of, like, Kieran Gillen is maybe my favorite person, like, one of my favorite cis writers that I see tackling trans characters.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't get a chance to get into it, but oh my gosh, Die probably has my favorite, like, trans narrative in a story that's not really about being trans.
Yeah.
But yeah, like there's a short list of cis writers that I would still love to have on this show. And like Kieran Gillen is definitely on the top of that list.
Yeah. No, yeah, Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing are both like the best people in superhero comics currently. Like not non-trans writers at superhero comics writing queer and trans themes in superhero stuff and also in non-superhero stuff for Kieran Gillen and Wicked and Divine, Die and all his other stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, check out Trade Issues if you're interested in any of that. We are about to start we're currently recording episodes on the manga Berserk, the first arcs of that. Then we're going to do Jeff Smith's Bone, which is like very big series that I know next to nothing about. And then we're tackling Sandman, which I weirdly have never read a single page of Sandman. I barely know what it looks like. I kind of know what it's about. And it seems like something that I would love. It seems like something that tackles like, ideas of myth and stuff, like everything we've talked about today that I would probably love, but always been out of my radar. So it's going to be a nice opportunity to discover that. Yeah. And for my writing, I don't write much these days, haven't had the time, but like the last article I wrote was on the character of Spider-Gwen in the Across the Spider-Verse movie. I mentioned that before. You can find that on the Comic Book Herald website, which is like great place to find stuff about comics. And yeah, type Spider-Gwen on Comic Book Herald and you'll probably find it. And I'm really proud of that. So yeah, I'd be glad if you read it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And if the listeners at home have requests or recommendations for comics or creators you'd like to hear us cover in the future, you can send them our way on social media. You can find us on the Transcending Comics Instagram and Facebook page, on Twitter as @TranscendComics, or email us at transcendingcomics@gmail.com. We'd like to thank you for giving our podcast a chance and give a shout out to Ray Day Parade for designing our logo. Our intro and outro music this week is A Little Soul and You've Been Starring by Carlson. Check out more of his music on carlson.com. Join us again next week as we continue transcending boundaries and exploring the colorful world of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer representation in comic books of all kinds. As the curtains fall on this episode of Transcending Comics, remember that comics have the power to inspire change in countless worlds, including our own. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep transcending.
Hell yeah.